everybody. Welcome back. Welcome to those of you who are not here. If you're an early career scholar stroke innovator, which is what I've just been told to call you, which of course I think of you as all as that, could you come and sit up at the table? So Chris is going to moderate and he'll lead off the discussion, but as I said earlier, this morning, the afternoon sessions will be featuring our colleagues from Washington University. First, our early career colleagues are going to talk about some of the innovative work they do. And then after that, there'll be a panel with some of our senior colleagues talking about what are some of the ways we can support this kind of work at WashU. And as ever, and hi everybody online, and as ever, we welcome collaboration and comments from people here in the room. So thank you.
Thanks, Stephanie. Thanks again, everyone, for being here. Those of you who are just joining us, it's been a really exciting day so far of conversation around rethinking tenure and promotion assessment and standards. So this next panel is called Here, and we're offering snapshots of innovation. Namely, here we have 7 scholars at WashU who are pushing the envelopes of the fields, exploring new theories and methods, and taking the humanities into new realms of thought and practice. Also, sorry, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Chris Schaberg. I'm Director of Public Scholarship. I'm new here, clearly.
Good introduction.
So the goal of this panel is to learn what about their current work is motivating these scholars. We will hear what is inspiring each of them, pushing them to test boundaries and experiment, maybe even what is terrifying them a little, because, well, it is their lives we are talking about, and let's be frank, scholarly and creative work in a university setting must walk a high, tight rope between being visible and yet modest, safe and yet daring, deferential to established figures, while being iconoclastic and utterly field-changing. Yes, you must be all these things, and able to toggle on a dime to present one side, then the other. So how do we celebrate the original work of leading-edge scholars while making sure to provide safety nets and solid support structures? Well, to start this work, we need to know what they are doing in the first place, and to be able to speak and act in support of this work in turn. Today we'll hear from Asim, Assistant Professor of English, Jianqing Chen, Assistant Professor of East Asian Languages and Cultures and Film and Media Studies, Nathan Dize, Assistant Professor of French, Kirilloff, Assistant Professor of English, Maragh-Lloyd, Assistant Professor of African American Studies, Film and Media Studies, Sarah Weston, Assistant Professor of English, and Anya, Yermakova, an ACLS Emerging Voices Fellow with the Center for the Humanities. We've asked them to prepare brief sketches of their current work. Think of these as core samples of their scholarship, creative practice, and research. After their presentations, depending on time, I may invite a few comments or responses from the audience, but really the goal here is simply to hear what is here, our innovative scholars at work. Thanks. So we're going to go in alphabetical order as on the program. So, Jianqing.
Hello everyone, my name is Asim. I'm an assistant professor of English and a creative nonfiction writer. When I'm not teaching or writing, I front a DIY punk band called Baby Got Back Talk. My creative nonfiction and the original music I make are mutually reinforcing projects. My first book, Boys in the Void, a mixtape to my brother, emerged from the synergy between being a professor and being a punk rocker. In the same vein, as I work towards the completion of my second book, the Tenure book, if you will, I'm also writing songs that will function as a musical. Among other things, the next book tracks and analyzes the American preoccupation with awkwardness. From Issa Rae's memoir, The Misadventures of Awkward Black Girl, to MTV's comedy series, Awkward, to Michael Cera's everything. The state of social discomfort and uncertainty has been played for laughs to great commercial success for decades now. But awkwardness has always struck me as something more sinister, or at least more serious. It functions like the interpersonal equivalent of a rumble strip. You know that you drifted off of the preferred discursive lane, but you feel that awkwardness set in. Anxiety and awkwardness are understandably dominant headwinds in the digital era. We are more surveilled, more policed, and held to more strenuous standards of perceived virtue than ever. The norms that govern how we are expected to interact with one another are in ever accelerating flux. Words that have fallen out of favor are not merely dated, but problematic. Adhering to tradition is less reliably interpreted as polite, and more often, as retrograde. I see a significant link between awkwardness and what some researchers call homophily, the notion that people tend to prefer and seek out companions they view as similar to themselves. That can include a predisposition to cluster with members of the same gender, race, or perceived social class. This preference is why exchanges across class and race boundaries can often produce feelings of discomfort, stress, or anxiety. Which means, of course, that where diversity, equity, and inclusion are points of emphasis, awkwardness is sure to follow. I'm going to speak briefly to how I hope to be supported in this work. I hope to lean on campus fixtures like the Center for the Literary Arts, the Center for Humanities, and the Center for the Study of Race, Ethnicity, and Equity as I continue to pursue this line of inquiry. Ideally, my work in the multimedia space that would include albums, music videos, video essays, might be taken into account when I'm considered for tenure. While my books are, of course, what I hang my hat on as a creative writing instructor, it's also the case that my work in other forms can expand and consolidate the WashU brand and elevate the visibility of the MFA program I teach in. I'm now going to perform a song from the musical counterpart of the book I'm working on. Or, to put it another way, I'm going to instantiate my subject by doing something that in this setting, at this moment, might be a little awkward.
Talk about awkward.
Sending all my love to friends and foes. It seems I lost my first, so I suppose that we may not go, but trust me, if I can cry. Count every single straw that's on the box. The smallest pillow help me to relax. Let's keep it stacked. I'm drawing it like a fact. Let's keep it stacked. I'm drawing it like a fact. Maybe it's just me who's out of time. 1863 is on my mind. Bring my own responsiveness on. This crazy double consciousness to solve. And we may not go, but trust me, if I can cry. Count every single straw that's on the box. The smallest pillow help me to relax. Let's keep it stacked. I'm drawing it like a fact. Let's keep it stacked. I'm drawing it like matter of fact.
Culture shift.
Yes.
Okay, great, thank you. Jianqing?
Yeah. I would rather to linger this a little bit longer than talking about my own research. But I'm Jianqing Chen, and I'm a Chinese film and digital media scholar. And in general, my research, I explore how emergent media has subtly remodeled our affective life. And I engage more with non-Western film and media culture. And which this kind of culture not only has become something very crucial for our understanding of different kind of regimes and areas, but also I think this kind of digital culture are very generative for us to think about new possibility for engaging with the global media, which become the global media, which is ideologically diverse and also politically pluralistic. I'm working on my first book titled Touchscreen, Everyday Media in Contemporary China, and I thank Chris for giving me this wonderful new title. And the book, I want to do the introduction a little bit quickly, and the book want to invite the readers to embark on a journey into the alternative digital media ecology in contemporary China. So the book has 5 chapters, and each engage with one popular media practice in China. Each exemplify a kind of touch screen gesture, such as zoom, pinching to zoom, or scrolling, or swiping, or typing, and I do this kind of investigation of different kinds of gesture through through examining a kind of a digital platform and also demographic groups who are very native to this regime, such as some of that Tencent Video or Bilibili or Douyin, which is the Chinese version of TikTok. So I think all this kind of media practice diverge to various degree from Silicon Valley's fantasy and would help us to understand the touchscreen media and also our life run through it nowadays. So to be honest, when I started this book project 7 years ago, the goal was very humble. I just don't want to write about something, the media phenomenon or platform I engage with on the daily basis. And then COVID happened, and then the US-China tech war kept escalating. And some of this media practice and the platform that I examine, such as TikTok or WeChat, achieve global popularity and generate a lot of a lot of fascination and also fear. Some of the issue I discussed in my book become embroiled in many kind of discussion, from international relationship, geopolitics, to everyday kind of a conversation. What kind of phone you would select? Which one is which kind of platform is better? So for this panel, Chris asked us to talk about what excites us for our current research. But I have to say, sometimes my research is both exciting and nerve-wracking because of this media or political climate. So I use my book, which is very exciting now, to challenge many misconceptions. Some of the popular media reinforce, even include New York Times. I do it by introduce my readers to this kind of media culture, which is rich, which is vibrating, but also complex and contentious, nothing that very different from the Western media culture. But also it's very nerve-wracking because some of the misconceptions I want to challenge are very pervasive and elusive because it becomes so dominant. And in terms of the support I hope to get, I want to say, after joining WSU at this very critical moment of a lot of radical transformation, many things I've dreamed or hoped for has been supported actually by WSU's existing resources and the newly emerged infrastructure. For example, the Humanities Digital Workshop, which I participated in the summer 2022. And also I'm very grateful for this newly founded program of public scholarship, which gave us a chance to use public-facing writing to engage with ever-changing technoculture. And also, I think it's also give us kind of opportunity to explore some of the ideas which are outside of the book project, or approach the same set of a question very differently by use different kind of genres of writing and with different kind of audience. And the other thing I want to mention very quickly at the end is that as a person who work at the intersection of humanity, art, science, and technology, I really hope we can have new modes to collaborate with people in other kind of schools or disciplines, such as people in St. Fox, people in Macaulay. For example, I feel like my research about this kind of, my writing of touchscreen technology would benefit from visiting the lab or just have conversation with them. But while opening ourselves to this kind of different kind of discipline and approach, I also hope to figure out actually more clearly our role as humanities scholar in this kind of disciplinary collaboration and investigation. So one of the hardest battle I have to say for humanities scholar who are devoted to investigating digital media and technology is trying to fight against a lot of scientific myths, such as progress, such as truth, what is the future. They has become so predominantly, and many, I have to say, scientific investigation or lab research, this kind of structure or institutional kind of mode are not exempt from this kind of myth. So as a humanities scholar, I think how shall we benefit from collaborating with those people in tech, well, without dissolving or losing our voice or critical edges as a humanities scholar is something we should explore together. And also, I think that is the institutional or infrastructure support could be very helpful. Thank you.
All right, thank you. My name is Nathan Dize. I'm an assistant professor of French. I'm just going to stick to the paper because that's where I'm most comfortable. I'd like to begin with a story. Sometime between 1919 and 1920, Jessie Redmond Fawcett was sitting in the 42nd Street branch of the New York Public Library, reading 4 volumes of Haitian poetry and prose. She wrote about her experience in The Crisis, one of the 2 magazines she was editing at the time for the NAACP. It was also during this reading session where she first read a sonnet called Oblivion by Haitian poet named Massion Kwaku. Fawcett would eventually publish a verse translation of the poem in James Weldon Johnson's landmark anthology, The Book of Negro Poetry, in 1922. Fawcett's translation would eventually be reprinted in some of the most important anthologies of African American poetry from the Harlem Renaissance to the present day, including Kevin Young's African American Poetry, 250 Years of Struggle and Song, released in 2020. What excites me about this story is also what bothers me. It's incredible that one of Jessie Redmond Fawcett's most memorable poems is a translation. Equally incredible is the skill that she deploys to make a structurally challenging poem composed in tight 10-syllable Alexandrian verse sing in English. And yet, when Fawcett is remembered, if she is remembered at all, it is never as a translator. In his autobiography, The Big C, Langston Hughes lovingly refers to Fawcett as, quote, one of the midwives of the Harlem Renaissance. The other 2 were men. Despite Hughes's generosity, Fawcett's other contemporaries like Claude McKay and Alan Locke derided her interest in 19th century aesthetics, as well as her interest in French, often calling her writing, quote, fastidious and precious. even though there have been movements to pull Fawcett from literary obscurity, led by Black feminist scholars like Deborah McDowell, Cheryl Wall, and Gloria Hull, there is a little confusion, one of the titles of her novels, about how to grapple with Fawcett's legacy as a translator. In an assessment, for instance, of her translation, Cheryl Wall, one of her greatest advocates, wrote, "Perhaps the poem is memorable in French. Fawcett's translation is not." So I ask, how can a translation that's been enshrined in almost every major African American poetry volume of the last century not be memorable? What would it mean to engage with Fawcett's life as a translator more closely, to examine her translations anew, endeavoring to understand what Fawcett wanted out of translation, a practice which translator and novelist Kate Briggs so eloquently calls this little art? The way I make sense of Fawcett's translation is, first and foremost, as a translator and as an artist. What interests me most in her work, and in the work of the other translators whose lives I explore in my book project, The Legacies of Black Translators of Francophone African and Caribbean Literature, comes from my own experiences as a translator. I've also built relationships with authors whose work I feel passionately about enough to translate. I've brought some of them here today. I've agonized over someone else's syntax, diction, rhyme scheme, and the very language they use to give shape to their literary art. I, too, have faced the criticism of editors and peer reviewers and folks in the field. I've defended an author's poetic intentions against a publishing industry that only wants, desires, and markets particular expressions of Black life. For years, I've carefully pursued my craft through and alongside another person's artistry. When asked to speak here today, I gladly accepted. I wanted to impress upon everyone why my creative practice matters as much to me as an artist as it does to the research I carry out. I'm aware that I'm in what is called, quote unquote, a book field, and yet the 4 books that I've published do not weigh as much as the academic monograph that has yet to emerge. Nonetheless, they took countless hours to write, sometimes almost a decade to finish, research and craft, sometimes with the authors themselves, and they cannot be discounted. And I thought about a couple things that could be done to acknowledge translation in wider humanities field. If we'll remember too, people cannot be nominated for prizes such as the Nobel Prize, National Book Awards, things like this, without the enterprise of translation. So I would advise you to pay close attention to the guidance published by PEN America, PEN International, the American Literary Translators Association, the Translators Association of the UK Society of Authors, and you'll also note that these are Western entities as well. So there can be a lot done, or some thinking to be done about how to interpolate and engage with Global South notions of translation. Ngugi wa Thiong'o is a great person to start with.
And he is coming here.
Yes. Follow the research published by World Literature Today, which has always enshrined and honored the work of translators. The PMLA, I'm very happy that Brent Hayes Edwards is at the helm of the journal, and there is a great issue with a wonderful article by Karen Emmerich that if you were on a tenure and promotion committee, you should go read.
And one by Olivia Lott, who was a Hispanic Studies graduate student
Yes.
in my department.
The College Language Association Journal, which has always provided a space for African American and scholars of color globally to examine the work of translators, especially non-white translators, as well as Words Without Borders. And I'd also, this is a bigger question, but reflect on how translation might constitute another layer of field work, which is to say that it's a venture, an enterprise that pushes multiple humanities fields forward simultaneously, and the work that it's doing must be recognized. Thank you.
Gabby? Yeah?
Sorry. Hi everyone, I'm Gabby Kirilloff. I'm an assistant professor in the English department, pretty new here.
First off, thanks to Chris and Stephanie for organizing this wonderful event. I'm very appreciative of the chance to speak with you all and to hear everything that's been taking place this morning. So my main area of focus is the digital humanities, specifically the realm of the digital humanities, sometimes referred to as cultural analytics. So what that means is I apply computational tools and tools from data science and from computer science to the study of literature. So those can seem like somewhat odd bedfellows, so to kind of walk through what that can look like and why I personally find it very exciting, I thought I might share a little bit about a research project I did actually a few years ago that was very transformative for me personally in terms of how I approach data and how I use data in my work. So this was a project, it was collaborative, it was done in a lab setting. I was leading the project and I was leading a team in a lab setting. And we were interested in using computers to study gender and agency in the novel. Basically, we wanted to see if we could use computational tools to get a better picture of gender stereotypes. So what we did is we trained a machine classification model to guess the gender of a character based only on the verb the character was performing. So if we gave the model a sentence like X wandered or X sat, could the model guess the gender of X based on that verb? The model could. Depressingly, 81% of the time, based only on the verb. So that sort of blew my mind a little bit, but the more I thought about it, the more what we learned from the model was actually sort of what we already knew. Gender stereotypes are very pervasive in the 19th and 20th century as they are today, and the verbs that we were getting feedback on kind of fit into what we know about domesticity and gender roles in the 19th and 20th century. So a lot of digital humanities projects, I think, would sort of stop there. We had our historical analysis, we had our charts and our graphs of the different fluctuations of these verbs over time, but we decided that the really interesting thing to pursue was the novels that didn't do the stereotypes. So because we created a model that could guess, we could also look at where the model failed to guess correctly. So out of 3,000 novels, would anyone like to give a guess? How many novels did the model completely get wrong? It guessed that most of the female characters were male and most of the male characters were female. So out of 3,000, how many threw the model for a loop? Anyone want to take a guess? 5. 5. Ooh, I like how you're thinking. Yes. Anyone? It's great when someone starts with like 1,000, and I can be like, no. Any other guesses?
100?
Thank you for even 9.
Oh.
Yeah, definitely. So good guess. So only 9 out of the 3,000 novels totally threw the model for a loop. Who really wants to go read those 9 novels now? Because that's yes, right? As the humanist, I was like, okay, time to read these novels. So that's when things started to get fun. The next article that came out of the project was a close reading of 3 of those novels, some of which were canonical, Jane Eyre was in there, some of which were completely forgotten. So being able to put these in juxtaposition and sort of learn from the connections between them is really interesting. The final stage of the project took everything that we learned and applied it to a single novel that wasn't part of the original corpus. We applied these kind of different things we had learned about verbs and behavior and action to reading Edith Wharton's Age of Innocence. And what came out of that project, paying attention to all of the sitting and the standing and the hovering, I think was actually a radically different reading of the way that characters perform gender in that novel. So that was sort of a high point for me. So I share this story because the movement from what is often referred to as distant reading to extremely close reading is what characterizes my work. So that sort of movement is what I'm working on now in a book project, a hot mess of a book project that attempts to use, I'm turning it into a feature, it's a selling point. In fact, it's risky. It's an attempt to sort of apply this move of distant to close. I created a computational model that will detect direct address in the novel. So moving from Dear Reader of the 19th century to breaking the fourth wall of today. And then reflecting on where data fits into that conversation all the way throughout. So that's sort of what I'm working on. What I think is exciting about what I do is that so often people think that the power of computation is scale, is objectivity, is speed. We know that's not true. In the humanities, we know that's not true. But the answer is the power of computation is that it can defamiliarize what we think we know. So for me, being able to look at a novel that I know intimately with fresh eyes, because I have been able to see it anew through the lens of computation, is so powerful for me. So in terms of thinking about ways, I didn't think of specific things. I thought of kind of like three great, like big areas that I would like to have increased conversations around. Two of which came up, I think, a lot this morning. So the first is time. For those of us working in interdisciplinary, convergent, transdisciplinary scholarship, it takes a lot of time. You're trying to become an expert in multiple conversations. You're trying to reinvent certain deals. And our scholarship just moves at different speeds and different paces. The other is publication format, which is something that I think has come up for a number of us. A lot of my work looks like code, publishing code, or publishing visualizations, or publishing articles that are more kind of in data science-y places, potentially, than humanities places. But the other thing that I haven't really heard come up too much today that I wanted to draw attention to is failure. So there's an increasing conversation in the digital humanities about the fact that we need to acknowledge and talk about failure. And I think part of that pressure, the reason we're not doing that, is because a lot of folks in DH are early career, and it is difficult and risky to talk about failure pre-tenure, and how do you credit failure. So in the sciences, there are models for what do you do if you publish something and it's just supporting, it's providing more evidence for something that we already know to be true, right? What do you do if you ran a study and it failed, right? There's still methods for publishing that. But we don't necessarily have strong conversations or kind of acknowledgement or evaluation of failure, and failure is a huge part of my work. So that's something that I would love to have more conversations about, but thank you.
Thank you, Debbie. Raven?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. I'm going to start my timer. That was hard to follow. I'm in such good company. I'm so humbled and honored to be like here with you all, but also like really with y'all. My name is Maragh-Lloyd. I'm an assistant professor in African and African American Studies and Film and Media Studies. And I want to talk briefly about two big projects I'm on that have seemingly have nothing to do with each other in order to continue this conversation about what we need with like innovative work. So the first is my book, which is out in January, called Black Networked Resistance. Like half upright. Okay. The book's out in January, Black Networked Resistance, and this is a book that came out of my thinking really after 2014, when a lot of the conversations about hashtag Black Lives Matter and resistance online was about like serious activism, all of which is super important, like protests and hashtags and what are the outcomes that are coming out of activism online, right? Like what votes are we changing, how many bodies are in the streets to protest, again, very important. But I was at the time thinking about my networks online that looked a little bit different, what I call untraditional resistance strategies. So, for example, my friends and I were sharing the geolocation of activists to keep the receipts in case something were to happen to those activists, right? Like to make sure those activists had like a digital trace. Or we were sharing funny memes with each other where we reframed conversations around police violence to like make each other laugh. Like there was no other point but to like make each other laugh. And so that's what the book is about. It's about untraditional resistance strategies. Each chapter is a different resistance strategy, like care, or I have a Karen chapter, so I talk about humor and Karens. I talk about archiving, right? Like all these different ways that Black folks online push back against different things in ways that we might not think of as like outcome driven, but actually are very important in different ways. And then of course I trace the lineage of those strategies. I have a cancel culture chapter, and I trace sort of the lineage, right, back to boycotting and economic divestment. So that's the first thing. The second is something much newer. One of my projects is looking at how people understand algorithms online. So this is a grant-funded project. It was over the course of 3 years, and my team and I essentially, we did like surveys with 2,500 people, and then the computer scientists did stuff computer scientists do. You know, they like they followed pulse data of people's like online actions, and then the third piece was interviewing, and that was the part I was involved with. So what we did was, and we're just getting back the data from this summer, we interviewed 76 people, and we sent them 4 main topics that were like high impact topics at the time. So critical race theory, vaccination, abortion I think was one. And then in real time, we had them search on YouTube critical race theory. These are the interviewees searching on YouTube. And then we had them read to us what were the results they saw, and then have them talk through what they thought of about their results. So again, we're looking at perceptions of algorithmic recommendations. So we're not in that piece of the project interested necessarily in how the algorithms work. We're interested in how people understand those algorithms. We had folks talk through like the right side of the screen, right? Like what were the suggested videos that come up? Do you think they align with your political or racial or ethnic or gender identifications, right? And what we found so far is super interesting. Like, for example, folks are personifying the algorithm. So a lot of times it's a he, a lot of times, which is different than the research because we're seeing like Siri, Alexa, right? There's a lot of feminization of technology. And folks so far are really seeing like this gender, he is making me, you know, he wants me to vote in a certain way or whatever. So we're sort of like getting through that data and trying to uncover what's happening. So I'll spend the last 10 seconds sort of bridging through how I see those two projects intersecting, and what I find exciting about my work. So for me, I get to spend meaningful time with the questions that keep me up at night. So these are like, you know, untraditional resistance strategies or what people think about algorithms. And what I love about the humanities is we get to joyfully sort of immerse ourselves in these questions and maybe unapologetically immerse ourselves in these questions. And these questions to me leave breadcrumbs for impact across multiple fields and their industries. We might focus on the impact and not so much on the breadcrumbs, and that's where I'd like to leave us today. We might perhaps thinking about like how this, you know, suggestions for later, they're seemingly niche fields like Black digital practices, right? Like, oh, that's only important when #BLM comes to be, right? And my suggestion is maybe to focus on or give, you know, continued highlight to these seemingly niche fields beyond just when like, you know, a big conversation happens, because they become the building blocks for those bigger questions as they come up. Okay, so other things I thought about was teaching. So in one of my classes this semester, I had one of my comp sci colleagues come in and talk about like scraping data, and we ripped it all apart. We like, you know, critiqued it and talked about the ethics of you know, what it looks like to study race online using big data, and also like we learned how to do it, right? And so I thought about that and I was like, man, as I put this in my tenure and promotion files, it'll probably be like a line. It'll probably say like, this one time during teaching, I did this thing. And that was, I can't speak for the students, but they loved it. They loved, these are film and media studies students. Shout out to my chair, Dr. Bogos, who like helped me pay the person to come in class. But the students loved it. They loved like getting to code, right, and getting to see how coding happens and also critique it. But I thought, you know, privately to myself, like, man, will this matter beyond a one line? So I don't know, like ways to think through teaching and innovation in teaching beyond like a line. Yeah.
So yeah, my name is Sarah Weston. Weston. I'm in my first semester as an assistant professor in English and in art history by courtesy. My first book project is on romanticism and math, but I am speaking about something kind of completely different. I'm interested in a lot of different areas of research, but they all somehow coagulate around William Blake, who was a printer, a poet, an artist in the 18th and 19th centuries. I am also a poet and printmaker and book artist, and I'm particularly interested in replicating 18th and 19th century printmaking techniques, and then using those techniques to actually produce editions of my own poetry and illustrations. So these experiences in the print shop and in my garage have actually experiencing the craft of making these objects. It's given me unbelievable insight into the works of art and literature that I get to study. Blake, for example, designed a daring and a revolutionary and very difficult printmaking process. His infernal method informed almost every artistic, stylistic, and even poetic decision that he made in his books. But most literary scholars who study him do so from a great distance, unaware of the intricacies of his craft and the many difficulties that he faced working with wax, feathers, varnish, copper plates, acids. So early on into my studies of Blake, I sort of realized that I was going to have a lot of difficulty speaking with any authority about his works without actually putting his methods into practice. So I wrote and illustrated my own set of Songs of Innocence and of Experience, which is sort of his main text that we all study in English now. And I apprenticed how to replicate Blake's process of etching and printing to create an edition of my own set of poetry. So reverse engineering Blake involved designing two coherent sets of poems, replicating his rhyme scheme, his metrical patterns, designing aesthetics for both sets of the poems that I was creating, researching art historical precedents for both of those aesthetics, illustrating every plate, and then putting all of those designs and words onto copper. Several times I did that using Blake's process of retrography, which is writing backwards using a mirror. It's very difficult. And I also etched all of these copper plates using very finicky acid baths. And it's very easy to mess up, and when you mess up, you have to start over from scratch and start over just basically from the beginning. So did all of this, I mixed my own pigments, I inked my plates. I realized I shouldn't have included as much negative space on all of my designs because it was so hard to ink those plates. So this whole process just really changed how I approach my work, my perspective as a scholar, sort of giving me a profound respect for Blake as a craftsman, prompting me to rethink assumptions about sort of Blake that I had held for a very long time about his symbolism and designs. And it also showed me places where the sturdiness of some approaches to his scholarship sort of start to fumble a little bit, like how much weight should we put aside an eco-critical reading of Blake's vegetal designs and curlicues when, first and foremost, he needed those as a crutch for his dauber. So all of this takes an incredibly long amount of time. The technical aspect is really laborious. I'm dealing with incredibly fussy and volatile materials. There's a lot of trial. There is mostly error. In my early stages of working on this project, it would take days to just produce one plate of about 50 of that initial project. So this work has all taken primarily a backseat to my scholarship and my scholarly work. It's been kind of a hobby, something I do in snatches of free time. I'm always aware that any time I do spend on these pursuits is time that I could have been spending, revising an article, working on a chapter of my dissertation. But to me, it's also invaluable in shaping my knowledge of the period of my work of study, and it's also been one of the most valuable pedagogical tools as well. Blake can frankly feel very enigmatic and obscure, and a lot of people he's a very difficult poet, very difficult artist to grasp, and so having a purchase on his technique and on his methods, it really helps sort of give students a way into talking about about sort of the more difficult texts that we read. So what do I want? So
what can we give you?
Yes. So tenure finals rely so heavily on published work, but a lot of the books that I make are one-off prints. And they cannot be mass reproduced. Blake was specifically creating a type of art and a type of book that it resisted mass production. So a lot of the work I do is not publishable in a traditional sense, although I would love it if there were presses that kind of embrace that half creative, half critical, work where I could reproduce the images that I'm making, reproduce the text of my poems, and then also sort of create a scholarship, weaving everything together, and being able to sort of explain how the different experimental methods that I'm using kind of does a call and response with Blake. So if anyone knows of presses that support that kind of work or would be interested in it, please let me know. So that would be great. It would also be great to have some kind of metric to evaluate the kind of work that I'm doing when it comes to tenure. It's a gigantic amount of work. It involves a ton of research itself. It shapes my research. It shapes my teaching. So it would be great to kind of be able to count that as part of my tenure file and include, get the time and space to do that work. And then sort of briefly, last thing, I wanted to note that I was hired last year, not in a specific subfield, 19th century British, but as a sort of vague and broad umbrella term, creative practice. And so those of you who are at other institutions, I think it would be, I'm like, this is an amazing direction that I think the English department here is taking. And it would just be wonderful to see that pop up at other institutions as well. See people recruiting scholars who can do both scholarship and then also creative work. And sort of find ways of marrying those two together.
Hi everyone. Thank you, Stephanie, for the invitation. It's really awesome to hear what everybody's up to. I'm maybe the odd one out. I'm a postdoc, not an assistant professor. And thank you, ACLS, for funding my postdoctoral tenure here. It's wonderful to meet you, Joy, in person. I sort of want to deviate a little bit from what I had written in light of what everybody's saying. I'll tell you about what I do, but I also want to make sure that I talk about my community and kind of the people who, like, I am here only because they have been and continue to be a part of my trajectory. So, and also to talk a little bit about how I do what I do rather than focus on the what. But I'll start with the what. My intellectual inquiry has always been about logic, even though it's sometimes been undercover in different disciplines. But I've always worried about history and philosophy of logic, especially at the periphery of sort of Eurocentric understanding of logic and logical normativity. Some tacit assumptions that have long escaped truth tables and syllogistic reasoning and have permeated a kind of social fabric of common sense and what constitutes common sense, which is an immense tool of power that oftentimes is actually difficult to pin down. Where is that coming from? I think about logic that's enacted, not only inscribed, logic that's embodied, and I dream of a possible world of sense-making and meaning-making in which enacted and embodied logics are on par with, not necessarily superior then, but certainly not submissive or submissive to, the sort of normative binaryism favoring logicality that's hegemonic today. And I found my way towards artistic research methods, largely in sound and in movement, because there was an inherent incommensurability between the questions I was asking about logic and trying to get at where these normative assumptions coming from about what constitutes logic and what does it have to be, and the methods that were being offered by my doctoral disciplinary home, which was history of science. And because artistic research is something that was already accessible to me because I was trained as a musician and as a dancer, those methods seemed particularly apt and particularly useful. And at the same time, it wasn't necessarily clear which method. So I tried things. I failed a lot. I spent a lot of time, making scores for an improvisation based on a logical snippet from an archive that isn't entirely complete to see what can become of this possible logic. And sometimes it wasn't a good idea. Sometimes it wasn't the right way. Sometimes they weren't the right researchers or the right bodies or the right people. I come back to community because I think, there was this kind of recurrent trial and error that constantly ended up inviting new voices and new kinds of people, new to me, new in the sense that they weren't offered by my discipline, they weren't sometimes within the academy, they weren't even, when I kind of started this archival work, anywhere in my imagination of who I can possibly work with in order to study the history of logic. And so, today my community includes certainly young scholars in the academy and people who do all sorts of creative practice and critical inquiry in some form of interplay. They're scattered in different departments in different universities in different countries. They all relate to this sort of notion of artistic research, but because that isn't a field, and even though there are, publications, some of which have value, some of which don't in certain disciplines, but we have an ongoing conversation. There are, for all the times that I wasn't going to disciplinary conferences, I was making and kind of working with others to make hybrid artist-scholar communities that I think now have become collectives. And a part of this collective called the Ocean Memory Project, which is artists, scientists, activists, humanists, working with this very loose concept that has been unbelievably generative. I'm a part of this collective called the Friends of Attention, which is started by a university professor, but it's people keep joining it in these very fluid, self-organized residencies, questioning the economy, the politics and the economy around attention. I'm a part of this collective called Vision Lab, which was started by a graduate student at the time at a divinity school, and has been an incredible hub for kind of mixed intellectual and artistic work and artistic labor. And when I think about assessment, which I sort of listening to this morning, through this morning session, my own assessment along the way, because there isn't necessarily a disciplinary, guide when I'm trying out these different methods, is the work that I'm doing any good? My disciplinary, or my own assessment is these people, and they include, they have to constantly include new voices in order for me to keep asking that question with enough rigor that I feel like I'm actually answering it rather than paying lip service to something. When I think about assessment at the university level, and I'm not in the being up for tenure conversation, but I think it would be a dream to be seen and to be understood, not in these disciplinary categories, but on the methodological level. Like, I'm constantly innovating methods. That's what I feel like I'm always doing in conversation with these people. And there's a politic and an ethic of care that necessarily gets generated when all of these communities and all of these people that I'm constantly in conversation with, nobody has a very, just like me, nobody has a very strict or well-defined or clear pathway of what does it mean to do good work, what does it mean to be successful. There's just constantly this, checking that happens with one another. I think one other thing I'll just end with, studying logic doesn't necessarily seem like a humanistic question, but I think along the way my project and my thinking has all been about kind of inserting bodies back into logicality. And I think while we'd be hard-pressed to find pretty much any field of inquiry that doesn't in some way rely on some kind of logic to make its point, we rarely sort of take a step back and to kind of question, where is that logic coming from? And I think if, my argument is about, well, it has to have bodies, it has to be embodied, it has to be in community, that also means that, the humanistic discipline and the humanistic enterprise as such has to take bodies seriously by inviting embodied research methods into the university. Thank you.
Thank you all. This has been just amazing. I mean, especially for me, just being here. It's like, who are all these people I'm with now? Oh, amazing. So we have a little bit of time for
We have like 5 minutes.
5 minutes for just impression. I promised everyone this wouldn't be a methodological grilling, but just impressions, responses, thoughts, objections.
No objections.
I was going to ask, do any of you know, did you know each other before you came in the room? Some people. Well, this is English people.
Yeah.
One English people.
We'll talk about community, like writing retreats hosted by the Office of the Provost, digital stuff, you know, so we
I was going to say, those are the places where new things emerge and new questions, and so I'm glad to hear that there's those kind of supports are there.
It's the same question, but I just want to say how amazing all your work is. Incredible, really. So just thank you. That's it.
So I'd like to congratulate the hiring committee, the search committee. But I'm just wondering whether any of you were surprised, given the kind of work that you do, that you got hired.
It definitely couldn't be the only thing that I was hired for. Like, yeah, it ended up becoming a big part of it because it was a creative practice search. And so that was something that I never thought I could possibly get time to do, like kind of seriously. So it's really great to have that opportunity.
And so I think to your point, Steve, it's the idea that we've managed to bring these people, now we have to find out how we support them.
I'm so interested. I mean, we don't have enough time to go everybody, but I would love to hear from everyone because the work is really amazing and innovative, and I want to know everything about where it came from, but more specifically, maybe more answerable in your prior stage in your doctoral programs, especially. You know, where on this on the spectrum of total welcoming acceptance and celebration all the way to outright resistance and warning and be careful, like where did your doctor
And we can skip a little bit. We can go a little bit over time if people here can stay to talk a little bit about their
so you can get the temperature, yeah.
Can I take that? And I started writing this, and that's where I started, actually. The first things that I was told when I went to find a master's program was avoid learning Haitian Creole and avoid translation because you won't get a job and they won't count for anything.
Wow.
And my questions were, count to whom and for whom, and well, maybe this isn't what I want to be doing, but I think things have changed. There's an openness, and I think, you know, one of the reasons why we're all here is that the institution is open to these methods, and so we find ourselves in community.
Anyone else want to take Joy's question?
What about the computation? My friend, the computation analyst. Where did that come from?
I was very lucky. I was super supported in graduate school, and I would not be where I am today if it weren't for amazing support and mentorship. I went to University of Nebraska for my PhD, and I worked with Matthew Jockers and Steve Ramsey and some other folks who were kind of important figures in the digital humanities, and I kind of knew going into grad school that that's what I want to do. I'm going to go to a program that's going to be friendly to me. It's not going to think I'm too much of a weirdo. A little bit weird is okay. But I mean, it was an amazing experience. Like, I could not, you know, I went into grad school thinking I would do digital archival studies. I worked for the Blake Archive. When I did my master's, Blake is, you get all the points for studying Blake. But I thought that was going to be my path, and when I was there, I got into programming and doing statistical analysis and everything. And I mean, I was the kid who in college, you know, thought that I could not do basic math. I was terrified of computers. I had such low confidence around those things, and if I hadn't been in a program with really strong mentorship, I wouldn't be in the position that I am today to mentor other people to get into this. So I'm super grateful for it.
My advisor didn't know that I did this at all.
Yeah. We hear that a lot of days about the secret CV.
Yeah, like in the garage CV.
Yeah. Yep.
Also, Will, aren't you the first PhD who was both in art history and English literature at Yale?
Yeah.
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 You're a groundbreaker.
She's the best. But
No, I'm just envious. I'm in the wrong generation. One thing we talked about years ago was having like a reading room, which could also be a music performance room, a place for you to show your books, a place where we could check out online what you're doing and screens. And it got lost at some point, but a humanities reading room where we could also just run by and maybe see you would would just be brilliant because community, maps so maybe can we put that forward again? That was in one of Anka and someone else. We were talking about it in the Netherworlds. I know we all have so much extra space.
Gabby, I'm just wondering, I'm just fascinated by your work, and I also, I want to echo what you said about failure and how we need to also model that for our students, because I think WashU students are particularly right, that are afraid to fail, afraid to not get an A. So but I'm wondering if students with an interest in STEM are drawn to you, like who have this humanities STEM
Yes.
sort of blend, or?
It has been, I love the students here, it's been a privilege so far. I teach programming classes here, so I teach an art class, and I was surprised that it was 75% STEM and 25% humanities when I taught it in the spring. I see what I do as kind of the gateway drug for both camps. It's a chance to get folks who are humanities curious to just pull them in to the English department, to get them to be critical of data, to get them to do what they want to do with computation. I think it goes the other way too. I think it's an opportunity. I taught an English class in the spring at the same time that I was teaching a programming class, and I snuck programming into it. It was called Computational Approaches to the Bestseller. And it's a chance for folks, I see it all the time, I didn't know this was for me, but these are the types of questions that I'm actually kind of really interested in, and I just kind of need that confidence, need to know it's okay to fail, need to know that their interests are what we need in computation right now to make computation a better, more productive space. So I think it goes both ways in an ideal world. Like when it's working, it goes both ways. But thanks for the question.
How are you all seeking and creating community for the kind of work that you do, both on campus and off?
It's absolutely critical. I mean, I wouldn't, none of these books would ever have existed without the mentorship of people who were either translation curious or recognized the import of it. And then that mentorship allows me and gives me the occasion to then pay that forward and mentor students. I exist in a couple of collectives of translators where we constantly, bat our work around and sort of help move it forward. And rejection is a huge part of translation because, the number of times that I've pitched a book and the idea of Haiti being on a map is a very strange thing already for the publisher. Having to then instruct them how to then market that book is a whole nother layer. And so it takes these communities to really pull resources from and pull lessons from to know how to speak to a tenure committee, how to speak to a job hiring committee so that you don't come off as, so you're not apologizing for something that's really important for you as part of your practice. And I think that's a lot of my experience was almost explaining away translation as something that's done in the classroom. Oh no, but we're always in French, because teaching in the target language is really important for my field. So how do you maintain that balance of this creative pursuit that relies on the language skill while also always being in the target language?
The only other thing I would add, yes, all of that in terms of academic communities, many of which came out of grad school, but having non-academic friends, especially in St. Louis, we talk about being in and for St. Louis, right? But for me, it helps having family here and just being immersed in different Black communities here in the city helps. I'm not writing about you, right? I'm writing with you and in community with, and in conversation with. And I bring my work back to these groups, right? And they rip it apart, and it's good.
I might also add that there's a big value, I think, in doing site-specific work, which can be done within university, across university, or within a city. Can be the idea of site can also be loosely defined, but. I got super excited about these bunkers that I discovered here.
Please tell us about the bunker. No, tell us about what's happening at the bunkers, because I think this is a group that needs to hear it. It is the coolest thing. And thank you to Anya for telling me about the bunkers.
So WashU has this environmental research station called Tyson, which is on land that used to be owned by the Army during World War II, where they constructed 52 bunkers. They very cleverly built into the landscape, kind of built into the hilly landscape. The idea was that you couldn't see it from aerial view. And then, you know, when WashU acquired this property, the bunkers just kind of stayed. And of course, they were built to store explosives and ammunition, so they're really built to like never go anywhere. They are these grotesque and extraordinary sonic structures, which, you know, they're basically these concrete half pipes that amplify indiscriminately whatever sound you put in there. And at the same time, they're war relics, wartime relics, right? And they're built into this environmental studies, this environmental landscape. So, I mean, it just, for me, it was this, you know, I was doing some writing already on the war happening in Ukraine and how that has impacted my work and my access to archives in Ukraine. And then, you know, and so I'm thinking about history of logic and archives and gaps in archives and war and like here are these bunkers that just show up. So, I mean, that ended up being a really interesting site of synthesis to like carry conversations with archivists who are now displaced as a result of the war, to think about the Bosnian community that's local to St. Louis, that's here as a result of the genocide that was taking place in the 1990s, to connect it with environmental studies. And I was just spending so much time there that I was like, Center for the Humanities, may I do a project there?
And the answer was yes, and so quickly tell everyone what you're doing.
So we're choosing a cohort of 10 to 12 graduate students.
Funded by Melon, thank you, Melon.
Who are going to be inhabiting this site throughout the spring semester. With my guidance, I'm developing a reading list for them, a listening list. There'll be a few meetings. And then at the end of the spring semester, there'll be a gathering there, a 2-day gathering to which we're inviting guests who do this kind of site-specific art and intellectual inquiry work, people specifically that work with sound, that specifically work with war as well. And you know, the students will be developing their own projects on this site. And back to sort of the point about methodology, you know, none of these students have to be studying history of war, but the premise is that they're going to be developing through their site-specific inhabitation of Tyson, they're going to be developing some kind of method that is specific to what they can then transfer to their research, their doctoral work or postdoctoral.
But also love Anya's idea of putting conversation between traditional ways of doing doctoral work, but also artistic research and creative practice, and how we can start to think about how. So we're very grateful that you're here and able to lead this work. So I think it's exciting.
Does inhabiting mean I have to sleep there?
You use the word inhabiting. I'm like, what's that mean?
I don't know if we're allowed to like
Okay.
when they're not sleeping there, right?
They do have 24/7 access.
Okay.
So who's to say? All right.
Pick that up in the next one.
Well, we have 5 minutes, or we can end and give people time.
No, I was going to ask about how do you, if your work is international, is that a problem for communities?
Yeah, actually, that's something I want to add. First, actually, I count students as part of my research community because I actually learned a lot from students' experience of interacting with a lot of the emergent digital technology students. So actually, you know, my field, or as a kind of a digital media on a global scale, is still emerging. And sometimes it's very hard to find secondary kind of readings which are engaging with non-Western or kind of media practice and technology, because we still understand media technology as something very Eurocentric, kind of centered, right? So the students actually have a lot of knowledge, and they are actually, some of my students write about, you know, the K-pop virtual idol, which kind of, you know, interrogate or make you feel you want to question about not only facial recognition technology but also deep faking, because that's become something so popular and even commercialized. So beyond the research lab or beyond this kind of, you know, what we're doing at the school, and students are very familiar with this kind of phenomenon and practice. and because a lot of students in my class are actually, they are they're cosmopolitan, they're like global, still international. They sometimes also, there is a kind of thing we almost want to question what is, for example, what is the boundary between East Asian study and also Asian American study when diaspora or immigration or this kind of global mobility becomes something so everyday life, so their life. So actually I kind of benefit a lot from students, and I actually understand my work sometimes, as not only inspired by them, but also they are the reader of my work. Yeah.
I have a question for Gira, if I can. So tell me, you talked about your tenure book, right? And I know you already have a book, and that book has that notion of music folded into it. But is the music, the song, which was amazing, and like I said, the first time I think in Coast Lounge, correct me if I'm wrong, but how is the music something that just informs the writing? Can the music be, at least what you've been told, can the music be part of your tenure dossier? Can the music be, or does it just have to be the add-on, the hobby? I know it's not a hobby, but can it be something that stands alone?
Yeah, it's a great question. Something I'm definitely still imagining myself. I would say what was very fortunate about the first book is that I definitely managed to find an audience within my band's listenership as well. People who don't, don't generally read books, would pick up Boys in the Void because of its connection to Baby Got Back Talk. So I envision a kind of similar synergy between the next book and some other music that I'm working on, which this song is a selection from. I kind of had this experience I guess this was like almost 2 years ago, but I was doing a public conversation with the author and musician John Darnielle. He fronts the Mountain Goats, and he released an excellent novel a couple years ago called The Devil House. And there was something about that conversation and the particular experience of having like a really exciting public event, which you could call a performance, and then sort of, instead of having like the experience with my bandmates that I'm accustomed to having after a show, which is like this really triumphant, collective feeling of exhaling and going, hey, look, we did it, right? I had that like same sort of thrill, but then I like went back to my empty apartment and just kind of pumped my fist to myself. And so that actually led me, I kind of interrogated that feeling, and it led me to actually start another musical outfit that would be able to sort of supplement some of my literary stuff, but it wouldn't be something that I'm doing completely by myself. I started a duo. And the impetus for starting the duo became something that I wrote about. So I kind of like mused on what the experience with John Darnielle was telling me about myself and sort of like what I needed in my emotional food pyramid, if you will. And so I started thinking about this other band as like a kind of deliberate, methodical infusion of a particular kind of connection and solidarity in my own life. So I reflect on that in the manuscript, and then people will also be able to listen to the product of that realization.
Awesome. That's so cool.
Thanks for asking.
Thank you all again.